Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Today channel. Brooke in a wedding dress makes a surprise appearance at Ridge and Taylor's wedding. Ridge and Taylor's wedding day, a crescendo of pristine ivory silk, fragrant white orchids trembling in crystal vases, and the low, reverent murmur of Los Angeles's elite gathered beneath the vaulted, sun-dappled ceiling of the grandest chapel in the city, reached its most fragile, anticipatory moment. The hushed pause before the organist's fingers would descend upon the keys to herald the bride's procession, a pause thick with the scent of hope and expensive perfume, where every rustle of program paper or stifled cough echoed like a minor blasphemy against the sacred solemnity, a pause utterly shattered, atomized into a million shards of disbelief, when the heavy, carved oak doors at the very back of the impossibly long aisle, bathed momentarily in a rectangle of blinding California sunlight, groaned open not to reveal the poised, radiant figure of Taylor Hayes in her legendary gown, but instead framed a vision so impossible, so devastatingly incongruous, that the collective gasp ripped through the chapel like a physical force, a vacuum sucking the air from hundreds of lungs. Brooke Logan, luminous, terrifyingly serene, standing resplendent not in the subdued elegance of a guest, but clad head to toe in an extravagant, breathtaking wedding dress of her own. A confection of blinding white Chantilly lace and shimmering Duchess satin that hugged her curves before cascading into a cathedral train that seemed to pool around her feet like frozen moonlight, the intricate beadwork catching the stained glass light and scattering it in defiant, dazzling shards across the stunned faces turned towards her, her entrance not a tentative step but a declaration, a silent detonation that froze time, rendering the opulent chapel a tableau vivant of utter shock. Every meticulously planned detail of the day, the cascading floral arches framing the altar where Ridge Forrester stood, momentarily oblivious, his broad back still turned as he adjusted his impeccably tailored tuxedo jacket, a faint, anticipatory smile playing on his lips as he awaited his bride, his Taylor, the woman who had weathered storms with him, the woman whose calm wisdom and enduring love had finally brought him to this moment of peaceful certainty, the nervous flutter of the junior bridesmaids clutching their bouquets of ivory roses and stephanotis at the head of the aisle, their youthful faces paling, the indulgent, proud smiles of Eric and Stephanie Forrester momentarily wiped clean, replaced by expressions of profound horror and dawning fury, the confused murmur dying instantly in Donna Logan's throat, her hand flying to her mouth not in joy but in abject terror for the chaos her sister had unleashed, even the soft, expectant notes the organist had just begun to play. Stuttering into discordant silence, everything dissolved into insignificance before the radiant, terrifying figure of Brooke. She didn't speak, didn't need to, the dress was her manifesto, her presence the ultimate, unanswerable challenge. Her gaze, unnervingly calm, swept over the paralyzed assembly, a queen surveying a realm she had just reclaimed by force, before finally, inevitably, landing with the weight of an anvil on the figure now slowly turning at the altar. The smile on Ridge Forrester's face evaporating as if scorched away, replaced by a dawning recognition that morphed instantaneously into raw, unadulterated shock, his eyes widening impossibly, the color draining from his face beneath his carefully styled hair, leaving him ashen, swaying slightly as if physically struck, his hand instinctively reaching out to grip the altar rail for support, his world, the carefully rebuilt foundation of his future with Taylor, crumbling beneath his feet in the space of a single, horrifying heartbeat. The silence that followed the initial gasp wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, charged with the electric crackle of impending disaster, thick with the unspoken questions screaming in every mind. How? Why? Is this real? Brooke began to move, not with the hesitant step of an intruder, but with the slow, deliberate, mesmerizing grace of a bride claiming her aisle, the soft, luxurious whisper of her satin train dragging across the plush crimson carpet the only sound in the cavernous space, a sound somehow more deafening than any scream, each step a measured advance that seemed to stretch time itself, amplifying the agony, forcing every single guest to witness the carnage unfolding in excruciating slow motion. Her focus remained locked on Ridge, a magnetic pull that ignored the hundreds of staring eyes, the dropped jaws, the hands clasped over mouths in scandalized disbelief. She saw only him, the man whose soul was irrevocably tangled with hers, no matter the vows he was about to take, no matter the rational choices made, the history they shared, a tempestuous ocean of passion, betrayal, forgiveness, and an undeniable, primal connection, surging back to the surface with volcanic force, visible in the tremor that ran through her, the slight tightening of her jaw beneath the serene mask, the fierce, almost desperate intensity burning in her eyes, a silent scream of possession and longing directed solely at him. Near the front, Steffy Forrester, rigid as marble in her maid-of-honor gown, her face a mask of icy fury, instinctively shifted as if to physically block Brooke's path, a protective shield for her mother, but the sheer audacity, the overwhelming visual impact of Brooke in that dress, halted her, leaving her trembling with impotent rage, her knuckles white around her bouquet. Thomas, beside her, looked utterly bewildered, glancing frantically between his father's crumbling form and the approaching apparition of his aunt, while Hope Logan, seated beside an ashen Liam, looked devastated, tears already welling in her eyes, understanding instantly the nuclear fallout this would unleash upon their fractured family. And then, piercing the unbearable tension, came a sound far more devastating than any gasp, a soft, choked sob from the side entrance. All heads, including Brooke's for the briefest, most chillingly dismissive flicker, swiveled towards the sound. There stood Taylor Hayes, the actual bride, partially obscured by the floral arch meant to frame her glorious entrance. She was a vision shattered. Her own magnificent gown, perhaps more elegant, more refined than Brooke's dramatic statement, seemed suddenly like a cruel joke. The delicate lace overlay at her bodice trembled violently with the force of her ragged breaths. One hand clutched the archway for support, the knuckles bloodless, the other pressed against her lips, smudging meticulously applied lipstick as she tried to stifle the whimpers escaping her throat. Her eyes, wide with a soul-deep horror and disbelief that transcended mere surprise, were fixed not on Ridge, but on Brooke, on the obscenity of that white dress, a symbol of everything Brooke had ever stolen, every insecurity Taylor had ever battled, every moment of peace she had fought for now obliterated in this single, spectacular act of psychological violence. The radiant happiness that had lit her features moments before was extinguished, replaced by a pallor of utter devastation, the look of a woman watching her future, her hard-won love, her very sense of self, being publicly flayed alive. Her bridesmaids huddled around her, murmuring useless comforts, their own faces masks of shock and pity, but Taylor seemed beyond their reach, trapped in a nightmare unfolding in brutal, high-definition reality. Her gaze, finally tearing away from Brooke's advancing figure, found Ridge's back, the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his head was bowed now, not in prayer, but in the crushing weight of impossible choice and catastrophic guilt, and in that moment, the fragile hope that had sustained her, the belief in their unshakable bond, visibly died in her eyes, replaced by a bleak, hollow understanding. The perfect wedding wasn't just interrupted, it was annihilated, replaced by a brutal, public execution of Taylor's dreams, with Brooke, resplendent in white, wielding the axe. Brooke reached the midpoint of the aisle, the epicenter of the emotional earthquake, the whispers now rising like an angry swarm of bees, unbelievable. How could she? Look at Taylor. Ridge looks like he's seen a ghost. But she remained an island of eerie calm in the raging sea of scandal, her focus solely on Ridge, who had finally managed to turn fully, his body visibly trembling, his expression a tortured landscape of shock, confusion, dawning anger, and beneath it all, an undeniable, unwelcome flicker of the old, destructive hunger Brooke could always ignite. He opened his mouth, perhaps to shout, to demand an explanation, to order her out, but no sound emerged, only a strangled rasp. His eyes, locked with hers, held a universe of shared history, stolen kisses in design rooms, fierce arguments echoing through Forrester Mansion, passionate reconciliations, bitter betrayals, the birth of children, the shared grief over losses, the unbreakable, maddening tether that bound them across decades and other marriages. Brooke stopped. She didn't need to reach the altar, her point was made with devastating clarity. She simply stood there, radiant and terrifying in her bridal finery, a living, breathing challenge to his resolve, a physical manifestation of the what-if that had haunted every relationship he'd ever had. She offered no explanation, no plea, just her presence, her beauty, her defiance, forcing him, forcing everyone, to confront the undeniable, inconvenient truth of their connection, a truth that had just crashed through the carefully constructed facade of his wedding day like a wrecking ball. The question hanging in the suffocating air, thick as incense, wasn't just why is she here, but what happens now? The meticulously planned ceremony was over before it began. In its place stood Brooke Logan, a surprise bride clad not for a new beginning, but for a declaration of war on the past, present, and any future that dared exclude her, leaving Ridge shattered at the altar of his own choices, Taylor weeping in the ruins of her happiness, and a chapel full of witnesses forever marked by the day Brooke Logan wore white to someone else's wedding. The silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by Taylor's muffled sobs and the deafening roar of unspoken devastation. Taylor, radiant in her understated yet elegant bridal gown, stood beside Ridge, the man who had once promised his heart to so many, but who today seemed ready to seal his vows with finality, the floral arches behind them glowing in warm candlelight, the perfume of roses and lilies hanging heavy in the air, the string quartet playing a tender arrangement that gave the room a reverent stillness, and just as the officiant lifted his voice to speak the words that would bind them, the massive double doors at the back of the room creaked open with agonizing slowness, heads turning like dominoes until the entire crowd had twisted around to look, and there, framed by light like some heavenly apparition, stood Brooke Logan, not in the demure attire of a respectful wedding guest but in a shimmering, form-fitting, breathtaking wedding gown of her own, white satin that clung to her with the confidence of a woman who knew her entrance alone could set hearts ablaze and worlds crashing down, a gown with a dramatic train and a veil tumbling from her golden hair like spun silk, her presence so shocking that gasps erupted across the room, even Taylor herself momentarily losing the perfect composure she had worn like armor throughout this entire ceremony, her eyes widening, lips parting in disbelief, while Ridge's face, usually so unreadable beneath its stoic lines, suddenly betrayed an avalanche of emotions, confusion, longing, guilt, and something so raw it made the air crackle, because Brooke wasn't just any woman, she was the woman, the ghost of every vow he had made, the temptation he could never quite banish, the eternal echo of his heart's contradictions, and now she stood there not as an invited observer but as a bride in her own right, challenging the very legitimacy of the vows about to be spoken. The guests whispered furiously, some clutching pearls, others leaning forward as though they were witnesses to the most daring act of love ever staged, and Brooke, never one to let silence weaken her dramatic timing, began her slow, steady walk down the aisle, each step deliberate, her heels striking the marble floor with a rhythm that overpowered the hesitant tremor of the quartet strings until the music faltered altogether, her voice then slicing through the tension, strong and unwavering despite the emotion brimming in her eyes, as she declared that this wedding could not, must not, go on, because while Taylor might be a beautiful bride and a worthy woman, Ridge's heart had always belonged, would always belong, to her, to Brooke, to the one woman who had loved him through scandal and betrayal, through passion and heartbreak, through every twist and turn of their endlessly tangled destiny, and though she had arrived here against every convention of propriety, wearing white not as mockery but as a declaration of her undying truth, she could not allow the man she loved to make a promise his soul would never fully honor, for love was not about stability or appearances. It was about fire and inevitability, about that unspoken recognition when two people looked into each other's eyes and knew they were home, and in that moment, as her words echoed across the hushed room, Ridge's eyes betrayed him, his gaze locking onto Brooke with that same unshakable intensity that had defined their story for decades, and Taylor, though poised and proud, felt the shift, felt the cruel but undeniable reminder that love, real love, is rarely gentle, rarely fair, rarely confined to ceremony and vows, and as Brooke reached the altar, veil shimmering like a halo, the world seemed to hold its breath, caught between the sanctity of a wedding and the irresistible force of a woman who refused to let the greatest love of her life slip away in silence, and it was in that collision of duty, desire, heartbreak, and destiny that the room seemed to fracture into two camps, those who rooted for the sanctity of Taylor's moment, and those who, however scandalized, could not deny the electric inevitability of Brooke's claim, for in soap operas as in life, the greatest drama is born not of predictability but of passion that cannot be tamed, and so Brooke stood there, a vision in white, an uninvited bride crashing the altar of fate, ready to reclaim what she believed was hers by divine right, and whether Ridge would yield to his vows or to his heart remained the one question vibrating through every soul in attendance, a question so searing, so intoxicating, that time itself seemed to pause on the knife's edge of his decision, the entire wedding held hostage by the sheer audacity of one woman's love. Ridge Forrester and Taylor Hayes' long-awaited nuptials, held within the hallowed, vaulted expanse of a sun-drenched cathedral adorned with cascades of fragrant white roses and lilies that seemed to breathe the very essence of purity and fresh starts, where shafts of golden afternoon light streamed through towering stained-glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the polished marble floors, and the expectant faces of Los Angeles's elite gathered in their finest silks and tailored suits, a congregation buzzing with the low hum of well wishes and the shared belief that this union, forged through decades of tumultuous passion, rivalry, profound loss, and eventual hard-won reconciliation, represented not just the joining of two souls but the final, blessed closure on a saga that had consumed their intertwined families for generations, had reached its sacred apex. The air itself felt thick with solemnity and unspoken relief as the radiant Taylor, a vision of ethereal beauty, in a breathtaking gown of antique lace that whispered of timeless elegance, its delicate sleeves caressing her shoulders, the fitted bodice giving way to a skirt that flowed like liquid ivory around her, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated joy and the profound peace of finally claiming her destiny, stood poised beside Ridge, whose own customary intensity seemed softened, almost serene, beneath the impeccably cut lines of his classic black tuxedo, his gaze fixed upon his bride with a tenderness that spoke volumes of his commitment to this moment, this woman, this future, his large hand enveloping hers with a protective warmth that banished any lingering ghosts, as the venerable officiant, his voice resonant and steady, imbued with the gravity of the occasion, began the irrevocable incantation. If anyone present knows of any reason why this man and this woman should not be joined in holy matrimony, a ritualistic pause designed for silence, for the final, formal clearing of any conceivable obstacle before the ultimate vows were exchanged, sealing their bond before God and this distinguished assembly that included Steffy and Thomas, their faces mirrors of profound happiness and vindication for their mother, Hope and Liam exchanging complex glances, Eric beaming with paternal pride, Donna dabbing at her eyes, Carter offering stoic support, and even Sheila Carter, lurking near the back, momentarily subdued by the palpable legitimacy of the scene. A pause that stretched, taut and expectant, filled only with the collective, respectful intake of breath and the faint rustle of expensive fabrics, a silence so profound it seemed to amplify the distant chirp of a bird outside and the rhythmic beating of countless hearts suspended in anticipation of the I-dos that would cement this hard-fought love story, when suddenly, with the shattering force of a crystal vase dropped onto that very marble floor, the towering, ornate oak doors at the far end of the nave, bathed in the backlight of the afternoon sun, groaned open with a slow, deliberate creak that echoed unnervingly through the sacred space, cutting through the sanctified silence like a physical blade, causing every head, as if pulled by an invisible string, to whip around in startled unison, a wave of bewildered murmurs rippling through the congregation like wind through wheat, the collective focus wrenching violently away from the altar and its poised couple towards this dramatic, unforeseen intrusion that disrupted the meticulously choreographed sanctity of the moment. And there, framed dramatically in the blinding rectangle of daylight, haloed by the sun's glare which momentarily obscured her features but unmistakably outlined the silhouette of a woman clad not in guest attire, but in the stark, provocative statement of a wedding gown, a gown of blinding white, daringly modern and sleek, clinging to a form instantly recognizable even in silhouette to every soul in that cathedral. Especially to the man standing frozen at the altar, his hand instinctively tightening around Taylor's to an almost painful degree, the color draining from his face as if he'd seen a specter, his eyes widening with a maelstrom of shock, disbelief, and a terrifying flicker of something perilously close to primal recognition, stood Brooke Logan. She didn't rush, she didn't falter, she owned the moment with the terrifying stillness of a predator claiming its territory, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate, almost processional grace that was both defiant and heartbreakingly vulnerable, the click of her impossibly high heels on the marble floor echoing like gunshots in the stunned silence that had descended, heavier now, thick with disbelief and burgeoning scandal. As she moved down the impossibly long center aisle, the sunlight catching the intricate beading on her bodice, the sleek lines of the dress that hugged her figure with possessive familiarity, the details resolved, her hair, perhaps slightly tousled as if by haste or inner turmoil, framed a face that was a masterpiece of complex emotion, not the triumphant smirk of a conqueror, but a raw, exposed landscape of desperate love, profound anguish, and an iron-willed determination that bordered on the fanatical. Her famous eyes, Usually sparkling with charm or flashing with fire, now dark pools of unshed tears and a terrifying intensity fixed solely, unwaveringly, on Ridge, piercing the distance between them, ignoring the gasps, the horrified whispers that now crescendoed into an audible wave. "Oh my God. Is that Brooke? In a wedding dress, oblivious to the scandalized glances, the hands flying to mouths, the furious, protective glare Steffy shot her way, the stunned disbelief on Thomas's face, the way Hope's hand flew to her own chest in sympathetic shock.